I scaled back my Mickey Mouse Band-Aid. I just got a little piece on there. It's gonna fall off, I'm sure. Anyways, this is the Turkish century. We just paused it. They're talking about Mustafa and his rise to being a general and all that. If you've missed it, which you shouldn't be watching this one if you've missed any of the others, it won't make sense. So, video.
There were no victories to be found there. After years of incompetent leadership under Jamal Pasha and his attempts to terrorize the Arabs into obedience, the Ottomans had all but lost control over Arabia. Jerusalem fell to the British, as did Basra and Baghdad, and the Arabs were in full revolt in the remaining lands. By 1918, the Arab revolt had their biggest victory when they took Damascus and started marching on Aleppo. Faced with what would have been certain defeat, Mustafa Kemal decided to instead save his army and organized a retreat back into Anatolia. It was at this point, literally in the same week that Mustafa Kemal retreated his army into Anatolia in fact, that the Sultan, Mehmed VI, reached out to the Allied powers for peace and had an armistice signed. The three Young Turk Pashas, who had dragged the Ottoman Empire into this catastrophe in the first place, as well as conducted the Armenian genocide, all fled abroad to escape being held accountable. Which in the end didn't help them much. Talat Pasha was shot dead by an Armenian in Berlin in 1921. Enver Pasha was killed by an Armenian Red Army officer in the Caucasus in 1922. Jamal Pasha was killed in Georgia in 1922 by a group of free Armenians. And many other senior Young Turk figures involved in the Armenian genocide who had fled abroad were killed by Armenians. It is also often forgotten today that in the aftermath of the war, legal action was taken against many of the Ottoman officials who had partaken in the Armenian genocide in the defeated Ottoman Empire. This was demanded by the Allies and also endorsed by Mustafa Kemal, who wrote,
"It is our main wish that the rule of law be applied impartially, and that complete justice begins. Since the responsibility in our country is equally shared by young and old, the punishment should not only remain on paper, thereby remaining only propaganda which can lead to many unnecessary discussions, but should be carried out, since this would successfully impress the foreign element."
The court-martials set up by the Istanbul and Ankara governments were however lackluster, designed in a way that cabinet members could influence outcomes and sentencing, and many of those involved managed to escape punishment. By 1920, in the Paris suburb of Sèvres, Sultan Mehmed VI was made to sign the Treaty of Sèvres, a peace treaty even harsher than the Treaty of Versailles was on the Germans. The Ottoman Empire's lands in Arabia were to be divided up between the British and the French. Eastern Anatolia would be divided up amongst the newly formed Armenian Republic and the new Kurdish state. Southern Anatolia would be given to the French. Eastern Anatolia divided amongst the Italians and Greeks. The Dardanelles and Istanbul would become a formerly international zone, however under British occupation, so basically part of the British Empire. The Turks would be restricted to a small remaining rump state in northern Anatolia, which was 15% of what the empire was before the war, and under a de facto colonial supervision. Adding to that were crippling reparations, and it became abundantly clear that the Turks were to have their lands divided up as colonies to the victors. This treaty was unacceptable to Mustafa Kemal, who in mid-1919 was tasked with reorganizing the Ottoman army to crush any resistance against the treaty and the Sultan in the remaining rump state. Instead, he assembled a congress and from the small town of Ankara declared independence from the Sultan's government and proclaimed to resist the foreign occupation of Anatolia, beginning the Turkish War of Independence. That war, from the onset, seemed absolutely hopeless. The Turks were on their own and pretty much surrounded. The Greeks used this crisis to invade Anatolia in an attempt to build a greater Greece. The Armenians also invaded in an attempt to take the lands inhabited by Armenians before the genocide. The French army occupied vast parts of southern Anatolia, intent on dismantling Ottoman state and cultural structures. A large British fleet was anchored in Istanbul, and the Kurds by now were eager to build their own promised state. But a series of events at the beginning of this conflict pushed things into Mustafa Kemal's favor. The British found oil in the Kurdish homelands of northern Mesopotamia, which led to them betraying the Kurds. Instead of giving them their own homeland, they clustered them into the new colonial administration of Iraq under Arab overlords. The remaining Kurds in Anatolia consequently sided with Mustafa Kemal, who promised them equality under Turkish rule and the resurrection of the Caliphate. Things looked far tougher in the east, as the Turks seemed to be in for a long protracted war with the Armenians. However, in 1920, out of the blue, the Soviet Union invaded Armenia and annexed it. With that, there were no more threats from the east. To the south, the French got bogged down in the guerrilla war with the local Turkish population, and in early 1920 were defeated by the Turkish National Army under Mustafa Kemal's command, leaving them with no other choice but to retreat back into French-occupied Syria. By far the biggest threat were the Greeks, who seized control of Anatolian lands that were actually promised to the Italians and marched into central Anatolia with one victory after another. The Greeks got close to taking Ankara but were halted and pushed back by 1921 under Mustafa Kemal's command. The war ended in 1922 with the Greeks retreating and the burning of the Greek city of Smyrna, which would later be rebuilt and renamed to Izmir. The end of the war with the Greeks pretty much solidified a Turkish victory, and the British, rather than fight, decided to abandon Istanbul and make peace with the Turks. This victory was a triumph that would cement Mustafa Kemal as a national hero even before he had established his state. There are only 5 countries in the world that avoided being colonized, most through concessions and alliances with other empires or by becoming colonial empires themselves. Turkey is unique amongst them, in that under Mustafa Kemal's leadership it is the only one which managed to avoid colonization by fighting those who sought to colonize it, and more importantly, doing so on its own and outnumbered. It made
I completely understand why he would fight that. You know, to have your country broken up is one thing, but to have it divvied out amongst other countries, yeah, I totally get that. And I called him Mustafa at the end of the last video, and then I corrected myself and called him Mustafa. But it was Mustafa. Mustafa. I'm gonna get it right, I promise.
Mustafa Kemal the savior of the nation and the revered leader and anti-colonial hero, even outside of Turkey, where many leaders in Arabia, Iran and Pakistan would seek to copy him in the future. This war, however, also significantly changed the social makeup of Anatolia. There used to be a Greek population of up to 2 million people in Anatolia before the First World War, and with the burning of Izmir, the last big Greek population center disappeared. You can today still travel throughout the coastlines of Anatolia, and you will find empty Greek towns and villages whose population packed and fled between 1914 and 1922. In the peace agreement, the League of Nations ordered a population exchange. 1.5 million Greeks were to leave Turkey and head for Greece, while 1 million Turks were to leave Greece and head for Turkey. It is important to note that today this would be considered to be ethnic cleansing, but at the time it was seen as a legitimate policy measure to guarantee peace. But, as we would see later, it didn't. What it did, however, do was change Anatolia, which for millennia had been a place of multiple cultures and faiths. The Christian population was reduced to a mere 2%, and the Anatolia Mustafa Kemal inherited was a by and large ethnically and religiously monomorphic society of Sunni Muslim Turks. Thousands of these Turks watched in late 1923 as the last British ships and troops left Istanbul. They all still wore the traditional Islamic headdress for men called the fez. Most of them probably had no idea that they were witnessing the dawn of a new age and the radical break with the past, unprecedented not just for Turkey but in all of human history. On the 29th of October 1923, the Turkish Republic was declared after the Sultanate had been abolished in the previous year. The only thing that this republic would keep from the past was the flag.
The politician who needs help of religion to govern is nothing but an idiot. For more than 500 years, the rules and theories of ancient Arabic sheikhs, Muhammad, and the absurd interpretations by generations of filthy and ignorant clergy in Turkey dictated all civil and criminal law. They dictated the state from the Constitution, the smallest of activities and gestures of citizens, their diet, the hours of rest and labor, the choice of clothing, the curriculum in schools, our manners and habits, and even our most intimate thoughts. Islam is a rotting corpse that is poisoning all of our lives.
Wow.
There are many different nations, but there is only one civilization. A prerequisite for the progress within a nation is to be a part of that civilization. There are no differences between the Orient and the Occident. There is only a difference between backwardsness and modernity.
The fez was a traditional Islamic headdress worn by men across the Islamic world. It originated in North Africa, and throughout the 17th and 18th century it became increasingly widespread throughout the Islamic world. From Indonesia to Morocco, devout Muslim men would wear it just as devout Muslim women would wear the veil. It became the official headgear of the Ottoman army uniform, and even non-Muslims who resided within the Ottoman Empire and Muslims who lived outside of the Ottoman Empire would wear it. It signified loyalty to the Caliph, the Islamic social order, the Ummah, and the Caliph's authority over the Islamic world. You can see the fez on the heads of the cheering crowds as the Turkish Republic is founded in 1923. At that time, 80% of that republic's population lived in the countryside. 90% could neither read nor write. Ideas such as nationalism, republicanism, liberalism, progress, modernity, science, or secularism were something most people had never even heard of. A national identity didn't exist, and most group identities were restricted to clans, religious groups, and family structures within rural villages. This was not a population that could carry and advance a revolution, especially since they wouldn't even understand what a revolution was or what they were doing it for, which consequently would shape what Atatürk's revolution would be, one dictated from the top to bottom, and not the other way around as revolutions usually go. This in return would leave behind a legacy of governance enforced autocratically from top to bottom, no matter what the wider rabble may think of it. Within a period of 14 years, the world of the average Turk was turned completely on its head. On the 3rd of March 1924, Mustafa Kemal formally abolished the caliphate. This might seem like nothing to you from an outsider's perspective, but remember, the Sultan and the Caliph were two separate institutions. The Sultanate had been abolished 2 years before with the founding of the Republic, but the Caliphate had still existed. There were many sultans throughout the Islamic world throughout its history, but there could only ever be one caliph. The caliph was not a pope of the Islamic world, but considered to be the spiritual descendant of Muhammad and to represent his authority as a religious authority to all Muslims. The caliphate had existed since Islam itself existed. The title had gone from the Umayyads to the Abbasids to the Ottomans, and was seen as an integral part of the Islamic faith and the understanding of the Ummah as a community of Muslims in the world under a leader. And with one stroke of a pen and the presidential proclamation, Mustafa Kemal abolished it. Gone was a central element of the Islamic world, an authority to all Muslims and their understanding of themselves as a group identity and part of a community that had existed for over 1,000 years.
So is this like he's just banished Islam in the state of Turkey, the country, you know, but is he basically just saying that there's no more Islam? Or is he saying that there is, but it's no longer, you don't have to live your life around it. You know, if you don't want to be religious, you don't have to be. If you want to be Christian, you can. You want to be whatever. You know, it's free reign to worship anything. Maybe, I'm sure it'll probably say it. I paused too early.
Consequences of this decision were monumental. Mustafa Kemal had promised the Kurds to protect the Caliphate in the War of Independence, which resulted in the first split between the Kurds and the Turks. But the consequences were even larger beyond the Turkish Republic. It completely shattered a key element in how many people in the Muslim world saw and understood themselves. What are we now? Who are we? What is our tribe? Our identity, our community? Are we still Muslims? Can Islam persist without the Caliphate? Are we nationalities? Are we Asians? Are we Africans? Are we Arabs? Are we Iranian? Are we races? Are we comrades? Are we a community? Can Jews or Christians be part of our community? Can we live with Hindus? Are we kings? Are we republicans? Are we back in the 6th century? What? Where? Who? How?
Yeah.
Many, if not most, of the problems throughout the Islamic countries in identity, politics, and nationality can be traced back to this fateful moment. From Gamal Abdel Nasser's proclamations of Arab nationalism, to Iran's Shah proclaiming himself to be a living god, to Jinnah founding a separate Muslim nation in India, to anti-Semitic pogroms in Iraq and Morocco, to the Saudis dragging their society back into the late Iron Age. On the 4th of April 1996, when Mohammed Omar founded the Taliban, he broke open the chest of the cloak inside the Shrine of the Cloak in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where Muhammad's cloak had been kept for centuries, and wrapped himself in it, proclaimed before his followers that he was the legitimate representative of Muhammad, the Caliph of all Muslims, leader of the new caliphate, and that the false gods of nationalism, democracy, and communism had failed. Events echoed when bin Laden proclaimed his war to restore the caliphate to the black flags recently flying over Iraq and Syria. It is still too early to say what the full consequences of Mustafa Kemal's decision were when he abolished an institution that he thought of as too backwards to be reformed and therefore had to be destroyed. But make no mistake about the tremendous impact that this decision had throughout the world. But for Mustafa Kemal, that decision was just the starting shot. He followed it up by banning the fez, turbans, niqab and burqa, and the criminal penalty. The hijab was banned in public spaces such as schools and government buildings, and women who throughout most of the history of the Islamic world had been silent figures forced into the background by religion were told to come forward and be public beings and figures. This was followed by the closing of all Islamic schools. Keep in mind that at the time, all schools were Islamic schools, and the Sunni clergy held a monopoly on education. This was now over. New schools were opened. The curriculum was entirely secular. Religion was scrapped entirely out of education, and education was compulsory, and far more radical, it was also compulsory for girls, who had previously, due to Islamic customs, been denied any and all education. This was followed by all women being granted and guaranteed legal equality before the law. And that was followed by the abolition of the Islamic calendar. It was no longer the year 1344, but the year 1925, as it was throughout the rest of the non-Muslim world. Next, he abolished Sharia law in its totality in each and every corner of the legal code, be it civil or criminal law. No more special taxes for non-Muslims, no more restrictions of freedoms, no more prohibition of alcohol, no more punishments for apostasy or other. He introduced freedom of consciousness, making it possible for Muslims to convert to other faiths, or even openly leave their faith and be open atheists. Marriages between faiths and lack of faiths were now legal without a spouse being forced to convert, as it would have been under Sharia. Mixed faith couples could now raise children together, which was forbidden under Sharia. The Islamic courts, Sharia justices, and the Sheikhul Islam, the highest religious legal authority in the land, were all abolished. He introduced a civil code of criminal and civil laws, shaped after examples set in Europe and North America, the first, and so far, only majority Muslim country to ever do so. Next, he banned the call to prayer from minarets at mosques. Next, all imams became state bureaucrats on government payroll, under control by a secular government institution. What could and could not be preached during religious sermons had to be approved by the state. Preaching in Arabic was abolished and had to be conducted in the Turkish language. Next, the Turkish alphabet was Latinized. The old Persian Arabic alphabet was replaced at all state and commercial institutions and schools. All adults who could read and write had to learn the new alphabet. All who couldn't read or write were taught to read and write with the new alphabet. All children would be raised with the new alphabet. Government advisors cautioned Mustafa Kemal to do this slowly and that it could only be done over the course of a decade. But Mustafa Kemal persisted and had this reform pushed through in 5 months. Next, all Turks had to take last names. Until then, people throughout the Islamic world had mostly only had 1 or 2 names, but there was no such thing as a last name or a family name. Mustafa Kemal changed that and took the last name Atatürk, which means the father of the Turks. He was the only one to take this name, and since he had no children, he would, in Turkish history, be the one and only father of the Turks. Next, Islam as the official religion of the state was cut out of the
So I wanted to hurry up and get through all the things he's done, and then I'm going to end the video. But at this rate, it's going to keep going. Man, it sounds like he dragged this country into the 20th century. You know, I'm not religious, so him disbanding the religious aspect, but all these other things that he's doing, I guess that would be because of the religious aspect. Well, when he's done...
Republic's constitution. This was then followed by secularism being written into the constitution, defining the Turkish Republic as a state that separates religion and state. And there's a note to be made here. The Turkish word for secularism is laikik, which is a francophone, a French loanword in the Turkish language based on the French term laïcité. And that is important because French secularism isn't your average secularism. While most modern republics define the separation of religion and state as a freedom of religion, in which citizens are free to worship, believe and practice their faith, and even base their politics on their religious beliefs as long as they don't force them upon others, French separation of religion and state, which is called laïcité, is defined as freedom from religion, in that you, the citizen, are freed from religion by the state. It bans religious dress from all government and public institutions, be they parliament or school. It forbids any and all religiously inspired or dictated social policy, be they through private organizations or elected officials. This uniquely French interpretation of secularism, derived from the French revolutions and its thinkers like Auguste Comte, is controversial to this day, as it gives the French government the authority to restrict religious expression in public, such as banning the burkini and burqa under criminal penalty. It also gives the French...
I don't think you should ban... If somebody wants to be religious and they want to wear the religious material, I don't think that should be a crime. I think that goes a little too far. You should be able to... just as you don't need... let me think of what I'm trying to say. You don't... Wow, it's not coming to me. You don't have to wear it. You choose to. You have chosen your path, your religious beliefs and da-da-da-da. And I think that that's okay. And if you want to wear that outfit, you want to, whatever, like that is your freedom of expression. Just like someone else over here who has a partial band-aid on their face, wearing a white shirt and shorts, has the right to express their belief, even if it's not a religious thing. I think that both are okay. I just think that one of them might be oppressive in how it tells everyone needs to act. Well, I wouldn't, there's no handbook for how I live that says that you have to do this and you can't do that. Does that make sense? I think we're going to keep rolling with the video because apparently he's never going to stop with the things he's done.
Authorities the power to restrict private religious programs and activities that the state determined to contravene the common good. For example, offering a pseudo-medical procedure known as gay conversion therapy in France is punished with a $60,000 fine and a 2-year prison sentence.
Wow.
Laïcité is far more invasive and has a more hands-on approach to the separation of state and religion than in most other republics and democracies. And it is this type of separation of religion and state which Atatürk adopted for his new republic. Turkish society was torn down to then be rebuilt and modeled after the European states of the time. But Atatürk didn't just want to catch up with the modernity of his neighbors, he wanted to outdo them. But where could he? In what regard were European and American nations still lagging behind in progress? These were for most modern states technologically advanced with legal equality for all men, but mostly only for men. At the turn of the decade, women's equality movements had sprung into action as they had never before in human history. This is where Atatürk saw an opportunity to show off the progress of his new society to the outside world, and to even hint on how his new republic might soon overtake all the others. In the decades before, the Ottomans had made a point of showing off their princes to the outside world as symbols of the empire. Atatürk turned this on its head. He adopted several young girls who showed promise in education and accomplishments, such as Afet İnan and Sabiha Gökçen. Afet İnan became an accomplished anthropologist and historian. Sabiha Gökçen became the world's first Air Force pilot, and they both were presented throughout the world as symbols of progress within the Turkish Republic. Most countries represent themselves through national symbols, such as a national animal. Within this concept of national symbols, France is unique as it represents itself as a woman, the famous Marianne, leading the revolution, Atatürk decided that the symbol of Turkey was to be a modern, dark-haired Turkish woman leading the nation to progress. These were the images that Atatürk wanted the world to see. No longer should Turkey be seen as this weird backward nation where veiled women are hidden behind closed doors, but a forward-thinking republic where a female president of a university and acclaimed historian can congratulate American women on receiving the right to vote and finally being the equals of their Turkish sisters.
Amerika kadınlığını takdir ederim. Çünkü siyasi haklarını tamamen kazanmışlardır. Türk kadınları da şimdiye kadar aldıkları haklarıyla iktifa etmeyeceklerdir.
One of Atatürk's biggest projects was his new capital. At first, there was confusion when he moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara. Istanbul had been one of the world's most important metropolis for millennia. Ankara was comparatively nothing, a small town.
Istanbul was Constantinople, right? That's what it was known as before. I believe so. Why the name change? I'm maybe different ownership of the region, possibly.
With a population of barely 30,000. But this was done for good reason. Compared to Istanbul, which had geographically been a central location in the larger empire, Ankara was geographically more central within the geography of the new republic. It was easier to access, had the only rail network leading into the south, and contained the headquarters of the army. But more importantly, the small size also served another purpose for Atatürk. He could build a new city for a new state in a new century. At a time when modernist architects were persecuted by fascist movements in Europe, Atatürk invited many of them, such as Bruno Taut, Clemens Holzmeister and Paul Bonatz, to come into a Turkish exile and build a new capital with him. What they built was the futuristic Ankara that we know today. Detached from many concepts of traditional Middle Eastern style of buildings, a modern European metropolis was stamped out of the ground. If you visit the city today, you will find the symbols of another cultural revolution that took place here, manifested in architecture. Best symbolized with the Road of Lions, because these lions are imitations of 10,000-year-old Hittite bronze figurines. Adding to that, the coat of arms that Atatürk chose for his new city was a Hittite sun wheel, and the Road of Lions is also not far away from the newly built Turkish National Museum, filled with Hittite, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman and nomadic artifacts. This might seem small to you from an outsider's perspective, but symbolized another monumental break from traditions and customs in Islamic societies. Before Atatürk, pre-Islamic cultures and relics were considered to be barbaric or even as sacrilegious or demonic by Islamic societies. In Arabia, ancient pre-Islamic castles and temples are being destroyed to this very day. Atatürk's new vision for his new state required the forging of a new national Turkish identity, and that new identity based on nationality, heritage and language made the ancient pre-Islamic civilizations part of that national identity. The Turks were to no longer just see themselves and identify themselves as just a part of a wider Islamic community, but to take pride in an identity with a wider historic legacy that included nomadic horsemen and ancient Anatolian civilizations. All of these reforms, the complete restructuring and reorganizing of a society in such a radical way, like it had almost never been done before or since in human history, happened within 14 years, between 1923 and 1937. The goal behind them was to create a modern state, shaped after a European republic. But precisely the problem there is that republics are more often than not societies with a right to self-determination for the individual. Ask yourself this: is a society that forces you to not be religious any better than a society that forces you to be religious? You might find forced political religiosity and religious doctrine more contemptible than forced secularism, but a key component in both remains the force.
That's what I was saying. I don't think that they should forcing someone to be religious. That sucks. Never been in that experience, so I can't say 100%. But forcing someone to not be religious, to not allow you to be religious, you have every right to be able to do that. You know, and if you want to be religious and you want to live your life under those religious beliefs, fine. But you've chosen to do that. You don't have the right to dictate those terms to someone else. You got to allow them to walk that plank. If they decide to jump into it, fine. If they decide to go back on the ship, whatever. But you shouldn't be allowed to force someone else to do that. So yeah, I mean, it is kind of similar. The force you to not be religious is what gets me. That's what gets me.
Erziehungsdiktatur is a term coined by the German historian Harald Neubert, who spent the final years of his academic career trying to figure out why the Soviet Union had failed. The word basically translates to educational dictatorship, or the educating dictatorship. The idea is that the state was ruled by an ideological minority who found their legitimacy not through public approval but within their own beliefs, and saw it as their role to rule as dictators until the public would finally be educated enough to see the validity of those beliefs and elect them through their own volition. However, in the Soviet Union, the dictatorial experience merely educated the people into rejecting that ideology. Atatürk's state was in many ways such an educational dictatorship. Atatürk saw himself as the first and last dictator of Turkey, the one dictator that the nation needed to educate it into never having another dictator again after him. The problem he had was putting this into effect. In 1925, he encouraged opposition figures to found a liberal opposition party with the intention of gradually democratizing society. However, seeing this as a weakness, disgruntled remnants of the Young Turks attempted to assassinate him, and the Kurdish Sheikh Said launched a rebellion to overthrow the republic, to reinstitute Sharia and re-establish the caliphate. The project of Turkish democracy was put on rest, and Atatürk responded with harsh measures, executing the remaining Young Turk leaders and launching a heavy military crackdown against the Kurds. It was after this backlash that he somewhat backtracked his previously more radical positions.
We believe that religion, which for the longest times has been used as an instrument of politics, must be liberated from politics to be elevated. We cannot abuse our holy faiths as instruments of politics.
It is unclear how sincere he may have been when making this statement. Atatürk himself had stopped practicing Islam in 1923, but besides the conflict with the religious population, the Kurdish uprising of 1925 also exposed other problems with the new vision of the Turkish national identity. The fact that it was built on a new nationalist identity formed exclusively around the Turkish language, heritage and culture. It left no room for Kurds, thereby sowing the seeds for inevitable future conflicts. It was an idea that left no room for any cultural, lingual and to some extent even political aberrations. However, the pluralism that Atatürk wished for this society to achieve requires such aberrations and diversity to exist. To ensure that his vision for the future after him would be safe, Atatürk established the National Security Council, an institution of generals that had the expressed permission to intervene in the politics of the country by force if the constitution of the secular republic was ever under threat of being undermined. A role usually given to civil opposition, and the Supreme Court was thereby handed to the army, guaranteeing even more future conflict potential. The cracks in all of this would show at some point. Decades later it would be revealed that Sabiha Gökçen, the war hero, a national symbol of Turkish social progress, was actually an Armenian, a genocide survivor adopted from an orphanage by Atatürk. The diversity in this society was still there. It was...
Is that bad? I don't think that's a bad thing.
Just hidden behind the scenes. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk died on the 10th of November 1938 at 9:05 in the morning. It is an easy historic date and time to remember, because every year on the 10th of November at 9:05 in the morning, the sirens go off in all Turkish cities and towns, and everyone stops in their tracks for a minute of silence.
Wow.
For outsiders, it all might seem somewhat weird to observe, almost like a personality cult in a dictatorship. But this is really not the case. Atatürk is genuinely revered by the Turkish people, who to this day see him as the savior of their nation and the founder of their modern society. To this day, they go to his memorial in Ankara in the millions to pay their respects. Years ago, when I first looked into this topic and had a conversation with a Turkish friend, I commented on how weird it was to me that Mustafa Kemal called himself the father of the Turks, and was abruptly interrupted by a "No, we call him the father of the Turks." As we go forward into the story of the Republic, you will find that Atatürk's shadow dominates over this state and its people throughout their journey through the 20th century. No other political figure would have as much of an impact on this country as he did, until 2003.
He's like George Washington. Wow. So this video was about 30 minutes. I wanted to cut it off, but they wouldn't stop, and I didn't want to interrupt him because he was on a roll talking about Atatürk. Atatürk. Oh, that makes sense. Duh. Right there. From them titties to the guy. Okay, I'm going to end this here. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Words.